We're back with more talking about the works of George Orwell. We're up to his fifth major book, A Clergyman's Daughter, a novel that he wrote around the same time as The Road to Wagenpier. This is the second novel, along with Keep the Aspidistra Flying, that Orwell really did not think well of at all, and I believe at one point even suggested should just, fall out of print and disappear forever. I believe he later changed his mind on the ground that maybe his heirs would make a few shekels out of it if they stayed in print, but he did not think this was a good book, and he wrote it for money again and wrote it probably as quickly as possible. However, in the context of Orwell's wider work and just in general, in the context of a novel about some unlikely things, I think this book has some really good parts and some good merits. I will describe it briefly. There is a young woman who is the daughter of a clergyman, an Anglican clergyman in a not very well off part of England. He treats her more or less like an indentured servant. She works herself to the bone, unpaid, to do work that he could do but does not want to. She does the pastoral visiting. She does what we would call in the U.S. Sunday school. She repairs the building. She does the shopping. She types up his sermon, while he sort of superciliously lazes around and invests in stocks. There's a section where she is listening to him invest and just rolling her eyes. She sees it all as basically just another form of gambling. So those of you who think that Orwell was always in favor of, say, a free market should at least give that a look. There was a great deal of skepticism about stock investing in the late 30s in Britain as well as in the U.S., since the Great Crash was often credited with leading to the Great Depression. So you didn't necessarily want to let people know that you were a stockbroker at that time. She is worn out. She's working like 16-hour days for no pay, on very little food. She doesn't stop to eat very often. And they owe bills all over town that people are only putting up with because they admire her so much as sort of genuinely virtuous person. She's a genuinely virtuous person. She feels as genuine ethical duties what her father only would pay lip service to, and what many people would, find ways of not doing, or at least not doing as conscientiously as she does. However, she then suffers from a sort of spell of traveling epileptic amnesia. She, this is maybe the part of the book that Orwell did not think that well of as a plot device. She just winds up south of London, like more than 100 miles away, with no memory of how she got there, and not even a real clear memory of who she is. It's like the Bourne Identity, but for Great Depression era England. And this is the part of the book where you can see this is kind of like Orwell had personal knowledge of certain things that he was able to write well about because he had experienced them. So how is he going to introduce this character into them? So there's this very clumsy device where she has this amnesia and winds up, where she doesn't know anyone, and she has no means at first of contacting her father, and then when she does acquire means of contacting him, he refuses to reply because he thinks that she's being like a rebel, like a recalcitrant child, and he tells her basically, come home, but I'm not going to help you do it. So she winds up living on her own for several months at least, maybe a year, before returning home with a renewed attitude. And during that, and that's partly what the book is about, is how her experiences of this year on her own change her life. So she goes through three major experiences, three major pieces of this year apart, all of which Orwell knew pretty well based on his own experience. One was she goes hop picking south of London with a bunch of sort of London working class folks. Orwell had done this. Hops, right? They're like those things they use to flavor beer. You got to pick tons of them, and they have a harvest, and you know, so it's like seasonal labor, and the people from most of it happens in the like a week or 2 weeks. So how do you get seasonal labor for that? Well, basically, like people in London, really poor and working class people, it's like their holiday to go hop picking. They leave, they get to go stay on this farm. They work, but it's not, as ridiculously hard as the work they normally do in London anyway. Or perhaps a lot of them in this case are unemployed. They get to camp. They don't really get paid in money, but they get sort of get out in the open air, and they do get like food. And then at the end of the harvest, they have this big jolly kind of night of partying, and the farmer will put on a good spread and get out some beer and maybe some whiskey, and they have a good time. Uh, so she hooks in with a group of people who are on their way to pick hops, and they don't really question it. They just sort of pick her up and take her along, and they're really nice. Generally speaking, the people she runs into on this leg of the adventure, they're really nice. She especially runs into this young guy who just picks a name for her at random and is kind of like an experienced tramp. He knows a lot of country living still. He knows a lot of the tricks of living in open country and living on nothing and finding food in the wild. All this stuff that you can just about imagine someone still living on in the England of the 1930s, although I imagine World War II pretty much put paid to that lifestyle. Uh, so he takes care of her. She learns to pick hops. The people there treat them as sort of like maybe they're kind of like a couple. And she learns that, basically these people who are from a lower class than her are just people. They're pretty nice. They're not particularly religious, and they don't use the language. They can tell by her accent that she's, not working class, but they don't think any worse of her, and they don't really question it. So she has this interval where she's learning about work and the lower classes, not just as a person from the upper class who, because they have a clerical obligation, like visit them and like bring them uplifting tracts or any of that kind of condescending virtuous stuff. She just gets to live with them. Next, she begins to remember who she is to the degree that she can try to contact home, and then she gets no reply and no help, and she is broke. She comes back to London. The man who she was with is picked up by the authorities for something fairly trivial like poaching or getting food he wasn't supposed to in some way he wasn't supposed to, and she takes up with the tramps in London. And Orwell here used his experiences in London that he talked about in Down and Out in Paris and London to describe this world pretty well. Just the world of people who they have no work, there's nowhere to sleep, they wander the city because you generally can't stay in one place too long, or police officers will sort of say, hey, move along. And the main piece of this that's worth noting is there's a long section in which Orwell tried something pretty fancy and set a major scene of this segment as a sort of play. So it's one of those. It's like a night when they're all trying to survive, a cold night, and they're out in the open somewhere like Trafalgar Square or something like that, and they're all huddled together for warmth, and people can't sleep, and they're just kind of talking and singing over each other, and the whole thing is set like and written as though you're reading like a play with like dialogue, and this character said that, and it's quite long. I think it's like 15-20 pages, and I wonder if maybe these were from some detailed notes that he took of an experience actually like this. And she is just appalled. She's just appalled that people in the richest country in the world, more or less, are living like this, like in the heart of the capital city. It's similar to that experience that some people have when they visit New York or DC or San Francisco or any of these really rich places, and you see all the people who are just living under overpasses or tenting out in a little stretch of grass between the highway, and it's appalling to her. It's pretty well written, and as a just a treatment of that material. It's not romantic. They're nice enough, but mostly, they're people just simply trying to survive. And she goes through some of the other experiences that he describes in Down and Unprecedented, like learning how just completely inadequate the charities are at helping these folks, and the horrible food, and how almost everyone there is men, and she eventually determines she has to find some way out of this. Her father is not helping, and we go into the third major segment of her time abroad, and this is the best segment to my mind, set against the general geniality of the working class people she met hop picking, and the just kind of desperate harmlessness of the tramps. She takes on a job with a private school, we would call it. I'm not sure exactly what it would be called in Britain at this time. The kind of school where it's not government funded. It's just this lady who runs the school and provides facilities, and the parents pay her. And it's awful. It's like it's like the just the worst. Orwell again had knowledge of this. He had done this kind of work when he got back to England, and he was determined to find sort of a different way to live, and he had taken on work like this, and it's terrible. It's not a school worthy of the name. The lady who owns it hates children, only takes them in for money, and squeezes every penny she can get out. So they get like no supplies. They get there are no expectations. It's all girls. This school. There's no expectations for them to learn anything. The only concern is crowd control and discipline, and the girls know this and they hate it, and so they just treat their teacher like crap. And the teacher, our heroine discovers, deals with this by drinking. She takes on the job. The other teacher quit mid-year, and this lady needs someone right away, so she hires her. And when she goes to look around the room, she finds this secret cache of empty whiskey bottles. So that's how you deal with that kind of school. Just stay drunk and insensitive to anything. Now she, as a kind of good, virtuous clergyman's daughter, wants to try to actually do the work that she's given to do, and she actually does quite well. This is a fairly, I think, decent portrait of the difference that an interested adult can make in the lives of young people. Because these girls she's with, they're not jerks by nature. It's the nature of the discipline they live under, where they're just required to, not learn anything in particular, to not do anything in particular except sort of look nice and have good etiquette. And so they're always pinching each other and lying and throwing things because they just hate the confinement. And there's the motives of their parents in doing this. There are government schools out there that are better than this, but their parents consider that low class. And they're snobs. They're lower middle class bourgeois snobs, and they want their kids to go to a private school, even if that private school is not worthy of the name. And Orwell goes on a little bit of an authorial rant here against this there's these horrible He's like, there's hundreds or thousands of these horrible private schools out there that just educate a few people and don't educate them at all, and they're just churning out, mean, nasty idiots who think that the only important thing in life is snobbery, just like their parents, and it's quite fun to watch him go on about it. So, but she turns it around. She gets paid very little, and she doesn't even get that much food because her employer doesn't want to waste a lot of money feeding a teacher, She winds up basically living on chocolate, more or less, for quite a while, because it's reasonably cheap and she can just about afford it. So she'll sneak bars of chocolate and get through to make up for the inadequate ration she gets from her employer. There's this really good scene. Orwell's very aware, like so many English writers seemingly, of these tiny little gradations of rank and these tiny little humiliations. So he has this bit. She comes down to breakfast. She's just taken on the job. She's supposed to get room, board, and a little bit of money. Come down for board, and board is like the cheapest breakfast you can imagine. It's like a piece of toast and like a sardine. It's like the cheapest food possible at this time. And there is some marmalade, and the marmalade is kept on the landlady's side of the table. The landlady's eating with her. The landlady also eats like garbage because she's driven solely by wealth. She doesn't really. She's not a hedonist. She just wants to make money, so she treats herself pretty badly too. She's got the marmalade on the side, and she's controlling the marmalade as a way of getting across to our heroine the level of control over her diet that she intends to have. She's not going. So it's like if you dared to ask her for a little of the marmalade, she would probably daintily hand you out some tiny portion that would be so embarrassing that you would be humiliated to ask again. And she keeps that on her side. And our heroine knows this. She's English enough to know when there's some kind of power struggle going on. So she knows to a certain degree not even to bother to ask. So the whole time they're there, she's having these breakfasts where the marmalade jar is used as a symbol of like that direct control over your livelihood. And that's one thing Orwell brought up sometime in his essays, is how human beings are basically bags for food. And so controlling the food they get, whether it's healthy and nourishing or whether it's rotten and noisome, is like a major element of injustice and a major battleground for societies. Still, she's a good person, and she's living on chocolate and sardine toast and little bits of crap. And thankfully, she had a reasonably good diet in her youth, so she can just about do this for a while and still function. And she tries many things that work in the school, that actually educate. So she gets the students out of these stupid old textbooks, and they start reading Shakespeare, and they build maps of history, and they get to draw pictures of what people's costumes look like at different times, and they play games. She buys books with her own money that they might actually want to read, and she generally treats them like human beings. And they do a 180. These kids who were treated so badly, within a couple of weeks, they're happy. They're happy again, and they're learning stuff, and they're behaving like well-treated human beings do behave, which is with trust and concern for each other. And it's almost worth it all. Like it's almost worth it living this life, even though she knows she can't do it much longer, to see these kids who were neglected and treated cruelly get a chance to have a real education. However, then she bumps up against another aspect of snobbery, and that's prudishness. So they're reading Shakespeare or the Bible or something, and the word womb comes up, and the girls don't know the word womb, and they want to know the word womb, and she hesitates, but she tells them the truth, and they learn the facts of life about where babies come from. He doesn't get into detail, but this is what gets her. This is what trips her up. She gets lambasted by both her employer and the parents, who of course they control the purse strings of the school, and they just humiliate her with this pompous scene where they force her to apologize and then more or less tell her, stop all the bullshit you're doing and go back to the old way and just treat our daughters like animals who need to be controlled. It's really depressing because it's so real. It's so familiar. And it's a private school, but this happens in public schools too. There's just usually some more layers of bureaucracy, but it just shows what a nightmare it can be for a teacher trying to satisfy all the competing demands between students, parents, and the administrator. So things go to pot. The students start behaving horribly again because they can tell that she's no longer allowed to be on their side, and they're no longer allowed to do the fun educational stuff that they were doing, and they're back to just sitting in chairs and learning useless scraps of garbage. And so they behave badly, and she starts to drink. Thankfully, she doesn't have very long to do it, because she's about to start the next term, and her employer fires her, and it turns out, that she she knew she was going to fire her, at the end of the last year, but she didn't want her to poach her clientele. She wanted to let her think she was going to be rehired until the very day. And the very day she said, "Okay, I've got someone else. You can go, leave." It's another good portrait of the power that employers have over employees. The power to sort of just humiliate and ruin plans. Because of course, if she were trying to get other teacher work, it'd be too late now. But no one owes her that kind of courtesy to let her know in time for her to look for a new job. They just kick her to the curb. So similarly, to keep the Aspidistra flying, there are a lot of scenes of the intimate humiliations that grow out of economic inequality and capitalist exploitation, which would reappear most often in Orwell's essays, but he did novelize them at times. The rest of the book is her finally getting back in contact with her father and returning home with the vision of her life altered, so that the slavishness that she'd formerly felt, like the trapped feeling towards her role and her life, has abated somewhat, because she has a wider vision now of the world that she lives in. She no longer feels singled out by an unfair god or something for an unlucky fate. And of course, seeing how much worse other people have sometimes has a feeling of making you a little more accustomed to yourself. Orwell tries to get, I don't think this is fully successful, he tries to suggest something more, that she has taken a kind of more beneficent, existential kind of attitude towards her life. I'm not sure that her experiences really support that level of transformation that he implies, that she's going to go through this life in a much more accepting and enduring kind of way. It's one way to end the book, and of course it's one thing that we do hope that we get from stepping outside of the usual stream of our life, is that we would get a perspective on it that would make it much more endurable and we would take more pleasure out of it. She's back doing one of the tasks that she was doing at the start of the book that no one else finished and still needs to be finished, and it's pretty clear that her life is going to be much as it was, but it's implied also that she's just going to be a happier person, because she has sort of a more developed inner life now. I'm not sure this part of the book works either. This might be part of what, besides the clumsy device of the traveling amnesia, or whatever you want to call it, I'm not sure that this works that well either, but it certainly expresses one of the hopes we have for travel and learning about the experiences of others and reading fiction and developing art, which is that by complicating our spirits, by enlarging and diversifying our souls and learning different shades and reflections upon what happens to us and others in life, that we will simply be in a better position to enjoy what life does have to offer us and to find new things that we had ignored. So at least as an expression of hope, the book has a good ending. Okay, Clergyman's Daughter. That's the last book that I believe Orwell was really unhappy with. The remaining four are, three of them are probably his best known books. The next one is going to be his memoir of his time fighting in the Spanish Civil War, called Homage to Catalonia. It's an excellent book, and we'll have lots to say about it. Okay, bye.